Hello, good evening. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education and its 2024 winter lecture titled The Fascist Threat, What It Means for Working Class Politics, featuring Adolph Reed, which all of you are doing. So the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education was founded by members of the Socialist Project. Essentially, it's a Toronto-based eco-socialist organization formed to provide radical, accessible, practical educational programming for those seeking for better understanding of history and the lineage of our current political times that we are facing. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land that we are here gathered around is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and New Credit First Nations, also Wendat and the Métis People's Land. It is a land on which we sit that is now called Toronto. And at the Socialist Project, we would like to go beyond this acknowledgement, which has become somewhat tokenism in other forums. But we believe that it is important to recognize the colonial legacy behind the taking of the land, culture, lives, as well as, to a great extent, the Indigenous people's livelihood. Further, we acknowledge that the right of the First Nations people to national self-determination. We believe it is our responsibility to organize, educate, mobilize, to erode capitalism and its reliance on racism, prejudice, oppression that keeps us divided from the people of this land and other Indigenous land, especially the land of the Palestinians. So before we invite our speaker to the stage, we have a very special speaker today, Melanie Panitch, the life partner, wife of our beloved friend and professor, Leo Panitch. In her own right, Dr. Melanie Panitch is the executive director of the Office of Social Innovation at the Toronto Metropolitan University, where she has been a leader in shaping vision for social innovation in the city, because her work goes beyond the university itself. So thank you, Melanie. Where are you?
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to this event in a church that has such a long-standing connection to social justice causes. My heartfelt thanks to the organizing committee for bringing us together tonight, and I'd like to say what a pleasure it's been to meet Matt Davis and work with him, who has played such a central role in orchestrating this event. I want to express my gratitude on behalf of Maxim and Vita for keeping their father's legacy alive, and I thank you personally for the opportunity to say a few words tonight. How much Leo would have loved to see you here, this crowd, this topic, this school. I know how moved he would be to see his work carried on in this way by so many friends and comrades, and to the younger activists in the crowd, you would have made him especially proud. He would have been especially thrilled to see you here tonight, Adolph. You've been in Toronto before on numerous occasions, and I remember those visits, and one in particular sitting in the bar at TIFF for hours, deep in discussion about the movie we had just seen, and no doubt about the article you would be crafting for the 2012 or the 2017 Socialist Register. Leo was a huge fan of yours, and that didn't only relate to your work and your loyalty to the Register. There was what you shared about jazz, and that you had digs in New Orleans. You may remember that Leo had found some information about a jazz cruise late in 2019 that really tempted him. Now, the cruise was somewhat out of character, but there was all that jazz. Wisely, he checked it out with you first. Behind this interest was the fact that he was looking ahead to celebrating an upcoming 75th birthday, and he was going to make sure it was a good one. Clearly, he wasn't taking any chances that I might plan something other. So on January 15th, in 2020, you responded to his inquiry about the cruise and discouraged the cruise idea, but instead, you proposed we come see you in New Orleans for the Jazz Festival. It was scheduled to run around May 3rd. You provided details and the lineup of the musicians, Terence Blanchard, Chick Corea, tribute to Louis Armstrong, and more. Leo was very excited because May 3rd was his actual birthday, so this trip was happening. On January 16th, the very next day, Leo wrote Sam and Schuster to see if they were in. They were. On January 17th at 11:16, Leo wrote us all that he'd already booked tickets and flights. At 12:30, a little over an hour later, Leo wrote that he had now purchased a package of tickets to the festival for the 6 of us to all the performances in the fairground. And at 1:51, Adolph, you wrote back saying, well, bless you, Leo, but shouldn't the birthday work the other way around? And you ended the note by embedding 5 links to a hot trombone player named Trombone Shorty, eager to whet our appetites. That trip didn't happen, sadly, part of the wave of COVID cancellations. But I'm happy to remember that episode tonight. I played those 5 links to Trombone Shorty, recalling the warm back and forth exchange of details and planning. It all spoke so powerfully to your friendship with Leo and your many shared interests, and why I know he would be thrilled that you're delivering this public lecture tonight. There will be others who will speak to your many impressive accomplishments and to the critical importance and timeliness of the topic you're going to address this evening. But I hoped in my comments to bring Leo into the room tonight, and I know he would so love to be here with all of us. I'm also thinking tonight of the many events and panels that I attended with him, and especially the various launches of the Socialist Register at the Lula Lounge. Afterwards, on the way home, he would ask sort of a rhetorical question, so how do you think that went? And I would poke him a bit and say, well, maybe next year you might try. But he'd always stop me mid-sentence, put his hand on my shoulder, draw me close and say, yeah, but it was great, right? And it was great, and this is great, and that is exactly what he would be saying tonight. I thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. What you said will resonate with us throughout the evening and as we embark on this immense project of the School for Socialist Education. So thank you very much. Now, the reason we're all here to hear our featured guest speaker, Adolph Reed Jr. Adolph Reed Jr., Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, will speak to us today on the fascist threat, what it means for working class politics. Now, to contextualize his talk, we have to go back to some of his books. First, The South, Jim Crow and its Afterlives, is about Reed's coming of age in the codified rules of Jim Crow era. Among his other books, No Politics But Class Politics is a fine collection of essays that he has co-published with Walter Ben Michaels. He has also authored Class Notes, The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, The Crisis in African American Politics, and many more. He's a prolific writer and activist of our times, and is a leading voice of progressives and socialist thought. I'll give you an example of what he writes about. He writes about inequality, and he writes about it in a way that it is redefined as how it became redefined as poverty, letting capitalism off the hook. He talks about it, how policy has shifted from calling for redistribution to essentially redistribution of wealth that we socialists talk about, to enforcing an ideology of personal responsibility, shifting the onus to the poor. His writings have appeared in academic journals and popular magazines, including Jacobin, The Progressive, The Village Voice, The New Republic, The Nation, Dissent Magazine, The Analysis News, and more recently, a podcast I urge all of you to tune into called Class Matters. The topic before us today, according to a Pew poll that came out recently, populist parties, right-wing parties have increased their vote share in many European elections, such as Sweden, Hungary, France, Poland, Netherlands, Italy. So the timing of this talk today cannot be better placed, given we are looking at the possibility of the return of Trump in the US. And about 2 months ago, when Javier Milei in Argentina, another populist right-wing leader, beat the Peronist candidate. And the first to congratulate him was Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil, and Trump. Together they saluted his arrival. Then in Europe, we have Marine Le Pen in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, which are other indications of this surge that is going on in terms of the rise of the right. Then there is Asia, where in 2022, Bongbong Marcos, the son of Ferdinand Marcos, and the daughter of the last dictator, practically a dictator, who governed the Philippines, Duterte, his daughter Sara Duterte won elections as well, marking a big right-wing shift in the Philippines. Therefore, we need to brace ourselves and learn as much as possible about the fascist threats before us. And here to speak on it, I give you Adolph Reed.
Sharmini, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep. Hi. But thank everyone who came out, all my dear friends in Toronto, and I'm honored to be here as a speaker for the Leo Panitch School and connected with the Socialist Project, Socialist Register. Melanie, thank you very, very much. It almost brought tears to my eyes. I remember it all very well. So, in sort of thinking about this topic and issue, I've asked two questions. How serious is the authoritarian threat in the US? And I know it's a concern to you because it's this sort of blazing mess of manure underneath your border. And what can we do about it? So the answer to the first question is pretty easy. That I believe most here will agree that that the threat is very serious, right? The authoritarian threat is serious. We can talk about whether it qualifies to be called fascist. We can quibble over that. I don't think it's an important question, but if we want to do it. I can't tell how many academics there are in the room. I assume there are some. And if there are some, then I'm sure there will be a few who want to quibble over a taxonomic question like that. Yeah, I believe most here will agree that the danger is significant. In fact, I think it's not unreasonable to fear that November's election could wind up being the last one in the United States in a long time. And even if the reactionaries don't win congressional majorities or tighten their grip on state legislatures and the governorships at the polls, there is little reason to doubt that some or many of them will attempt to take apparent electoral defeat as a pretext for provoking political crisis by refusing to accept results as legitimate to the point of mobilizing violent mob opposition. Of course, the dangerous anti-democratic tendencies did not emerge with Trump. He became a useful symbol around which they've been able to condense strategically and advance rapidly as an electoral movement. But those tendencies have been present in US politics and have been building in this direction for a long time. And I'm going to talk about that for a second too. And it's important to stress also that Democrats and liberals have accommodated and abetted their growth by ceding important interpretive and policy ground to them all along. And so with your indulgence, I'm going to rehearse some points I made more than a couple of, well, actually more than 2.5 years ago. I wrote, discrediting government and the idea of the public has been a component of the GOP game plan since Reagan. And that Democrats have reinforced that message in their own way. Jimmy Carter, whom some may recall, ran for the party's presidential nomination in 1976 on his record of having cut the size of Georgia's government as governor. And as president, he initiated deregulation as a policy priority and imposed the economic shock that paved the way for Reagan. And it was Bill Clinton, that is Bill Clinton, Democrat, who announced in his 1996 State of the Union message, the era of big government is over. And he followed through by terminating the federal government's 60-year commitments to provide direct income support for and housing for the indigent. Reagan attacked the social safety net as a wasteful giveaway for frauds and losers. Clinton, as avatar of what my son described at the time as the Democrats' Me Too, but not so much approach to politics, insisted that publicly provided social benefits should go only to those who, quote, play by the rules, end quote. 4 decades of retrenchment and privatization of the public sector, often under the guise of outsourcing for greater efficiency or doing more with less, which is the Democrats' favorite, which Clinton and Gore also, sanitized as reinventing government to make it leaner and smarter, combined with steadily increasing economic inequality and government's failure to address it in any meaningful way, to fuel lack of confidence, distrust, and hostility toward government, and toward public goods, and eventually even to the idea of the public itself. And the reactionary capitalist interests that bankroll the ultra-right have taken advantage of that unaddressed economic insecurity and stoked frustration and rage into a dangerously authoritarian political force. It wasn't such a big step from Rick Santelli's faux populist message, which some may recall, in 2009, calling from the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, of all places, for a Tea Party rising, right, to the January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection. Mitch McConnell's openly declared strategy of stalemating democratic initiatives of whatever sort, going back to the Obama administration, made clear that Republicans have no commitment to democratic government. Every move they made was directed, consciously or not, toward takeover via putsch or putsch dressed up as an election. The outcome of the 2000 presidential election was an early augury, as the George W. Bush campaign strong-armed a victory by means of actively partisan intervention by Katherine Harris, the Florida Secretary of State, who was also chair of the Bush presidential campaign, and mobilization of corporate goons to storm the Miami-Dade recount, and turning to a reactionary bloc of Supreme Court justices to place a fig leaf of legitimacy onto theft of the election. The Gore campaign's the reluctance to fight back aggressively was also an augury of the implications of Clintonism's victory within the party, as Gore, Kerry, and Obama all ran and Obama governed in pursuit of a bipartisan coalition anchored normatively by a non-existent moderate Republicans. And Hillary Clinton tried that approach as well, and thus did her part to put Trump in the White House in 2016. So see, the continuities are there, and this is not a new phenomenon. Some of the reactionary authoritarian tendencies that condensed around Trump and Trumpism have been festering and growing in American politics at least since the end of World War II. First, Barry Goldwater, then Ronald Reagan, brought them out of the shadowy underworld populated by such groups as the John Birch Society, the World Anti-Communist League, various McCarthyite tendencies, Klansmen and other white supremacists, America Firsters, ultra-reactionary groups with ties to shadowy international bodies like Operation Condor, that has specialized in state-centered terror and death squads in Latin America, and its equivalent in other regions. Christian nationalists, anti-Semites, and Islamophobes. During the Reagan presidency, the treasonous Iran-Contra operation showed these reactionaries' contempt for democratic government. The guide dog press, as it often does, sanitized the Iran-Contra treason as a scandal and dutifully shepherded public discussion of it away from the magnitude of the crimes against constitutional government and toward the puerile soap operatic question, what did Reagan or Oliver North or whichever one of them know, and when did he know it? They've been joined in the Trump years by a cornucopia of more or less organized thugs, the militant racists, and misogynists, open fascists, reactionary libertarians, sorry for the redundancy, and delusional conspiracists, damaged true believers, and utterly venal grifters, a category that cuts across all of the others, of course. And they're bankrolled by the American equivalent of German Junkers, billionaire reactionaries whose wealth largely derives from extractive and defense industries and other sectors that are particularly sensitive to the federal regulatory environment. The reactionary Federalist Society was founded in 1982 at Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. Where else, really? Law students, and now has stocked the federal judiciary up to the Supreme Court, including a hefty complement of Catholic fascists. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Federalist Society member, is the son of Anne Gorsuch Burford, Reagan's administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, where her mission, like that of current Associate Justice Clarence Thomas, as director of Reagan's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, was to gut the agency. Political scientist Gordon Lafer documents in the 1% Solution how corporations are remaking America one state at a time, how right-wing corporate lobbying groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, Americans for Prosperity, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the National Federation of Independent Business, all funded by the Koch brothers and other rich reactionaries, have organized at the state level to produce and pass anti-worker, anti-democratic legislation, and to secure and fortify the Republican control of state governments. Jane Meyer has done comparable work that to some degree updates Lafer's. Now, I'm not suggesting that some deep cabal has orchestrated an elaborate, decades-long conspiracy to seize power. That's not how politics, certainly not insurgent politics, in a mass society works. I'm also not interested in hashing out counterfactuals like whether this could have happened without James Buchanan, the Cato Institute, or the Koch brothers. What we do know that's pertinent to what we're up against at this moment is that after Goldwater's presidential run was crushed by Lyndon Johnson in 1964, enough of the militant ultra-reactionary core of his campaign took the lesson that they'd been talking too much only to themselves. Sound familiar to the lefties in the room? And went out into localities among largely suburban political constituencies to agitate and field test messages and issue bundles that could enable building an alliance that extends far beyond the ranks of those who would actually benefit from seizing the capitalist or from realizing the capitalist class agendas that ally at the movement's core. To be sure, sections of the reactionary right have held on to and are oriented by visions of the society as they'd like to see it be organized. And those visions are neither democratic nor egalitarian, of course. As their mundane political practice has evolved and their institutional power has grown, the movement's engineers have also improvised, balancing the practical objective of expanding and deepening a base and disciplined attentiveness to building power toward overturning all egalitarian reforms that have been won since the New Deal and imposing an authoritarian government, literally. That means, among other things, taking advantage of or concocting new issues that both inflame their broader base and permit them to set the terms of national or local political debate. So we can recall, for instance, how quickly and thoroughly the GOP establishment went from trying to stop Trump to playing Renfield to his Count Dracula. I have no idea how extensive the consciously putschist tendency has become among the right. The best one might say for Mitch McConnell, for example, is that his aspiration perhaps didn't extend much beyond immobilizing government, precluding any progressive legislation or appointments. Nor do I imagine that the likes of Lindsey Graham or even Kevin McCarthy had been impelled by radical ideological commitments more elaborate than advancing the immediate interests of the class they represent and suppressing those who might want to do anything else. That doesn't really matter, though. Like, the policy steps necessary to prepare for ultimate authoritarian victory are the same as those favored by less far-sighted reactionaries. Rolling back the regulatory apparatus, which includes civil rights enforcement, politicizing and attacking climate science using taxation and other federal policies to generate massive upward redistribution, stocking the judiciary, gutting the social safety net, and demonizing government at all levels, undermining labor rights and unionization and more, expunging even the very idea of a public. A couple of stratagems in the ongoing anti-public health panic are worth noting because they echo old school reactionary ideology from a time before, when the fiction of appeal to a popular audience encouraged public politesse. Some here also might recall that, that fairly early in the pandemic, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick urged elderly Americans to go out and contract the virus and sacrifice, is the word he used, themselves to keep the economy open, and referred to it actually as their patriotic duty to do so. Nor is he alone. Then, Newsmax talking head Rob Schmidt contended that vaccination goes against nature. And he opined, quote, if there is some disease out there, maybe that's just an ebb and flow to life where something's supposed to wipe out a certain amount of people, and that's just kind of the way evolution goes. Vaccines kind of stand in the way of that, end quote. So Schmidt and Patrick give voice to the element of the ultra-right that frets about propagation of unworthy populations, or losers, or to capture the snappy old school sensibility more directly, Lebens unwertes Leben, right? Life unworthy of life. Pandemic denial and opposition to public intervention to address dangers to public health come organically to this element, which has been part of the institutional foundation of ultra-right politics since the late 19th century, among them bankrollers of the eugenics movement from its beginnings. So with a startling quickness that bespeaks the depth and breadth of their organizational capacity, the Republican right mobilized an alliance of committed reactionaries, opportunist political operatives, anti-vaxxers, survivalists, and other more or less dangerous anti-government hobbyists, internet conspiracists, unhinged psychopaths, militant anti-communists, zealous anti-abortionists, and other Christian fanatics, would-be libertarians, gun nuts, unambiguous fascists, and ethno-nationalists. Actual, that is not simply people who say or do things that affront anti-racist liberals, but actual white supremacists, xenophobes, sexists, and anti-LGBTQ militants, desperate people seeking answers and solutions to the material and emotional insecurities that overwhelm their lives, and of course, the grifters who follow alongside the herd. I'm looking to pick off the weak and vulnerable. Even, I guess it's okay to say this isn't a Catholic church, is it? But I was going to say, even the right-wing Catholic bishops in the U.S., well, when they could find the time to get off Grindr, have been acting both to defy the Pope and to deny Joe Biden the sacrament because they don't think he's a Catholic. And if not, to excommunicate him, because some of those are pushing for that as well. And just for the record, I think I can say that from inside the paradigm. But notwithstanding their peculiar identities and issues, Trumpism has developed as the umbrella under which all of these disparate interests converge, with MAGA as a symbol that condenses all their disparate aspirations. And that didn't just happen either. It's a result of years of propaganda and organizing. Birtherism and Pizzagate built on the kayfabe principle to establish the movement's foundation in a truer truth than the world of facts and contradictions. That's how Trump supporters can declare sincerely that he's the only one telling the truth, even though practically every other word out of his mouth is a lie. No matter where he was born, Obama's essence was not American. If Democrats and cosmopolitan liberals are hidden pedophiles, and the image of the pedophile as quintessentially unqualifiable, conversation-stopping evil is also, by the way, the product of a bipartisan sex panic in the 1980s. And more recently, cannibals, and I think the cannibal thing took on shape as a charge among those the reactionaries for whom pedophilia just wasn't bad enough. Right. Then the problem is not what they stand for, what positions or policies they advance, and that's why belief in a stolen election is so impervious to rational argument. Biden stole the election because real Americans' votes were not permitted to prevail. Votes cast for him were fraudulent by definition because people who voted for him could not be legitimate Americans. In Oklahoma, after 2020, where Biden didn't carry a single county, a Republican legislator petitioned unsuccessfully for a forensic and independent audit of the vote tally in three counties in the state, because he thought that even though Biden didn't win any of these counties, that he got too many votes. So they had to be theft. This is shades of the high period of disfranchisement in the late 19th century South, when a Democratic putschist considered even one vote for a Republican too many. So perhaps most important and the most telling is how COVID conspiracy and the resistance to masking and vaccination were articulated and fed into widespread, round-the-clock, frenzied agitation, asserting the absolute primacy of individual rights over public concerns of any sort. This is the fruit of the half-century of relentless right-wing attack, again abetted by neoliberal Democrats, on the very idea of the public, which was already evident in proliferation of the belief that my right to carry an assault rifle into any public space outweighs or overrides concern for the public safety. And it was a short step from that to the assertion of my right to refuse to wear a mask, even in establishments that required them, or vaccination in the throes of a public health crisis. Okay. Although characterizations of the Republican Party as having become a death cult and the like can be arresting as metaphor and can get likes like on the internet, they don't really do us a lot of good, right? They don't help us. They don't help us to understand anything. What does help us, though, is to recall Margaret Thatcher's three most important dicta. One, there was no such thing as a society. There were individual men and women, and there were families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves. Two, the method is economics, but the object is to change the soul. And three, when asked to identify her greatest achievement, she replied, Tony Blair, because we got them to change their mind and change their politics. Okay. The extent to which that sort of solipsistic vision or solipsistic individualism has spread in American life, rational or not, ultimately reflects the victory of the Thatcherite vision. Many liberals, and not a few leftists, may dismiss the account that I gave here as wildly hyperbolic, although more of them have come around to acknowledging the real threat to democracy and what they fetishize as rule of law. But I think a key practical reason to stress the danger on the horizon is the possibility that the national and global political economic order we've known as neoliberalism has evolved to a point at which it is no longer capable of providing enough benefits, enough opportunity, enough security to enough of the population to maintain its popular legitimacy. I am hardly alone in suggesting that we may have come to a significant crossroad. People with much greater faith in and commitment to contemporary capitalism than I have, and who have much more sophisticated knowledge of its intricate workings than I have also expressed that view. Among them, Lawrence Summers, Paul Krugman, and others, Brian Dees of BlackRock. If neoliberalism has reached such an impasse, I've argued, that there are only two possible directions forward politically. One is toward social democracy or something like it, right, and pursuit of solidaristic, downwardly redistributive policy agendas, but within a framework of government in the public good. The other is toward authoritarianism. And I've sometimes described this as it being like a T-intersection. There are only two ways to go. And each direction is like the opposite of the other. What we have seen, as Sharmini noted in her comments, like the degree to which authoritarian movements are on the march in much of the globe, right? Europe, even like in Latin America at this point, after that moment of the pink tide. The reality that the processes of neoliberalization at their core rest uneasily with popular democracy makes reckoning with this right-wing tendency's growth all the more urgent. Insulation of policy processes as much as possible from popular oversight, which has been going on at least in the US since the 1970s, which is before we even had the term neoliberalism, is one illustration of it. And that's at the heart of the neoliberal accumulation. To that extent, it's naive to presume a capitalist class preference for democratic over authoritarian government, particularly if the democratic form comes with an opening to efforts to impinge on capital's prerogatives. Even if we take the corporate rush to affirm support for racial justice after George Floyd's murder as expressing genuine endorsements of anti-racist equality of opportunity and opposition to unequal and criminal hyper-policing, and not at all tainted by opportunism, is it reasonable to expect that, say, Uber, Amazon, McDonald's, or Goldman Sachs would actively fight for a form of government that might regulate their labor markets, practices, and their methods of accumulation, and might force them to pay taxes against one that promised to protect them? It's probably not a realistic thing to expect. As my friend and colleague, Walter Ben Michaels, and I have observed repeatedly, earnest institutional and individual commitment to an anti-disparitarian ideal of justice is entirely compatible with support for a society that becomes more and more sharply class-skewed and unequal in the aggregate. And just a little note, post-it, right, to take take forward with you. According to McKinsey Company, Fortune 1,500 companies, between May of 2020 and October of 2022, pledged $340 billion to driving racial equity, right, between that period. And we know what else they've been doing at the same time. All right. So I think we all have a sense that's a frightening moment we're facing. Yes? No? By show of hands, do you think it's a frightening moment? All right. Some not yet. Well, I'll try to convince you more like in Q&A. I'm going to stop banging on it. But I will say that very much hinges on Democrats beating back or holding off the Republican votes this coming November. And I know this is something that people are going to want to talk about, right, for a variety of reasons. But building a broad working class-based movement is the only way we might successfully defeat the reactionary right wing. And we need to begin trying to build the sort of popular movement that we need. And we must be clear that such a left movement does not yet exist, no matter how many internet announcements of imminent victory show up daily on our various electronic devices. There are many leftists and people who support leftist causes and programs, but a left with real political capacity has been absent for so long in the US that even most sympathetic people can't conceptualize what one would look like. How we could distinguish it from what my comrade Mark Dudzik calls the pageantry of protest, or the effluvia of premature proclamation and branding. Sorry. In fact, Dudzik and I, in an article in the Socialist Register, laid out what we mean by a serious movement. By left, we mean a reasonably coherent set of class-based and anti-capitalist ideas, programs, and policies that are embraced by a cohort of leaders and activists who are in a position to speak on behalf of and mobilize a broad constituency. Such a left would be, or would aspire to be, capable of setting the terms of debate in the ideological sphere and marshaling enough social power to intervene on behalf of the working class in the political economy. Some measures of that social power include ability to affect both the enterprise wage and the social wage, power to affect urban planning and development regimes, strength to intervene in the judicial and regulatory apparatus to defend and promote working class interests, power not only to defend the public sphere from encroachments by private capital, but also to expand the domain of non-commodified public goods, and generally to assert a force capable of influencing, even shaping, public policy in ways that advance the interests and security of the working class. Now, clearly, this is not the kind of formation that can be built overnight. You guys may be like 2 centimeters farther down the road toward building this kind of movement in Canada than we are, although my Canadian friends keep telling me, no, that's just a romantic twaddle. But we hope, right? But it's clear that we're nowhere near there. So, I mean, here's the problem, right? The problem is that the pace at which the right is moving is such that there's no way that we're going to be able to build the sort of left movement that we need to stop them by 2024. Right. Can't do it. So what happens? Well, I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to give you the good news and the bad news at the same time. Trumpism's success also has shown that making headway on this front, on the front of trying to undercut the noise of this tendency among the working class, will require undoing decades of bipartisan disparagement of public goods and propagation of both the Thatcherite fiction that there is no realm beyond the individual, and the Democrats' at best self-deluding fantasies about doing more or less. Many readers will recall from the 2008 presidential campaign the agitated cries among the McCain's backers calling on the federal government to keep your hands off my Medicare. Not understanding it was a federal program. That there's an ample social science and scholarship finding that whether or not one recognizes that government is the source of benefits one receives has an impact on trust in and regard for government. Seems to make sense, which would be the kind of thing that a political scientist would go figure out because it makes sense already. But the one study that I'll mention is by one of our former Penn students, Ashley Talebi, in a study of a study of Medicaid managed care and federal contraception policies. But anyway, that research, which dovetails with experience from the Debs Jones Douglas Institute's trainings, and I'm on the board and a functionary, basically, of DJDI, with the rank and file union workers on economic inequality and healthcare crisis, underscores that privatization and outsourcing are not merely objectionable insofar as they turn the public sector into a woodlot for profiteers, though they're objectionable for those reasons too. They also have been instrumental in implanting Thatcher's first dictum, no such thing as society, as common sense. And proliferation of that common sense marks the success of her second dictum, which is that the point is to change the soul, and the Democratic Party's trajectory from Bill Clinton to the Biden presidency is testament to the boast in her third. We can only chip away at those critical setbacks on the ideological front if leftists, including left or progressive-leaning advocacy and interest group, and most of all, the labor movement, lobby and agitate for that public good perspective and approach. Concretely, that means taking advantage of the openings, ambivalent and limited as they may be, to press where possible in our own networks, workplaces, civic engagements, and institutional affiliations. In the public realm, for those with ready access to it, for the administration's infrastructure plans to reinvigorate the public sector, but alas, and I want to bring your attention to one quite important thing to read, like an article on Bidenomics by our own Sam Gindin, called Bidenomics and the Left, in nonsite.org from 3 months ago, that dissects Bidenomics and what it is and isn't. The punchline that comes away from it is, as I imagine was the case with at least some other people in this room, after Biden was inaugurated, we were hoping that maybe that wing of the Democratic Party had been frightened enough by the danger of insurrection that they would give a little more toward the working class. And what Sam shows is that, like so much else, in our politics now, the sort of left tilt was performative and was much more about giving the appearance of redistribution and breaking with neoliberalism than it was with actually doing so. Does that sound fair, Sam? Okay, good. It's a very important article. But what this means, too, that what we have to do is working to anchor climate change policy to job creation and a serious commitment to make whole those workers who are displaced in the economic and social reorganization that addressing climate change will require. It means also agitating and building public support for initiatives like postal banking, like in the US, and eliminating the income cap on Social Security. I think now workers pay tax on only the first $162,000 earned a year. And this is how the other side, the bipartisan other side, can keep pretending that there's a crisis in the Social Security system because they won't fund a damn thing. In the electoral domain, and this is the kind of stuff that we've been trying to address in our trainings, in our worker trainings. In the electoral domain, at DJDI, we've observed in our worker trainings that even allusion to candidates or signature partisan issues for many workers sets off alarm bells. Distrust, barriers of unnecessary resistance to the substance of our training program. Some have recorded the same phenomenon, noting that even in states that characteristically vote Republican, voters have also passed ballot measures that raise the minimum wage and legislate other pro-worker initiatives that Republicans steadfastly oppose. This underscores the importance of getting outside the Democrat-Republican divide and gearing electoral interventions to push clear working class programs and agendas with an institutional base and foundation that can win them. That in turn suggests that electoral engagement can be more productively directed toward pursuit of ballot initiatives that place clear working class oriented proposals before the electorate without all the noise and confusion, personalism that accompany candidate-centered campaigns. An initiative led by the Massachusetts Teachers Association, the Massachusetts Fair Share Amendment, won a levy of 4% on incomes over $1 million a year, and which is projected to generate $2 billion annual revenue that will support education, transportation, and other public goods. And they want us at the ballot. And they have a couple more going now. Finally, and I direct this to Schuster, I sometimes hear that I don't want people ever to be happy or to celebrate political victories. So I'll close with what may at first blush not seem like an upbeat note. It is me, after all. Which I'll preface by pointing out that a few years ago, I binge-watched several political films from the 60s and early 70s in a day. I watched The Organizer, The Battle of Algiers, Z, and State of Siege. Thank you. And it's really uplifting, I gotta tell you. But that's the point. Like, I was struck that each film ends with a defeat, but that each was broadly understood in its moment as a profoundly optimistic film. I realized that such films couldn't be made now. What? No superheroes or magical interventions, right? Can't Black Panther go invisible or some shit? Fast forward to the present and the perils facing us. I faced up about a year ago to the likelihood that even if we begin to generate a working class movement of the sort that I argue that we need to meet the challenge, the greater likelihood is that we won't be able to defeat the authoritarian tide. It has too great a head start because it's so deeply rooted institutionally, and that led me to consider that our efforts now may be more for those who'll be around when the authoritarian regime begins to unravel, and who will be looking for ways forward. I found that thought somewhat pressing and really dispiriting, and kind of defeatist even, so I decided to repress the feeling for a while. But then eventually I mentioned, after all, like one implication of this is I'm 77 years old. Yeah, I won't be here right then. Well, yeah, as I said, this might be the last real election in my lifetime. But I mentioned my sad little epiphany to a colleague who's been experiencing the same concerns about our lack of capacity for mounting responses to the reactionary horrors. I was surprised that the response was elation, because like the sensibilities of that earlier left, the colleague understands and is rooted in appreciation of protracted struggle, and saw in that observation the basis for a practical sense of purpose. And on that recognition of the protracted character of our struggle is a reminder, first, that as the left, we face the same imperative to build a politics of broad working class solidarity, no matter whether we hope to defeat fascism now or farther down the road than we can currently envision, and that a realistic source of optimism in a moment like this is recognition that the ruling class's fantasies of its omnipotence are ultimately just that. But that makes re-electing Joe Biden no less vital now than it was before. Thank you very much. Simple answer. No, in fact, I had a discussion with a comrade of mine in Philly about that very issue this morning. No, because their point, what Compact is one of these clever right-wing moves. Right? The front is, this is a place where high-theory Marxists and high-theory reactionaries, that's all they are, can come together, find common ground, common discussion. Their point is to sell this image. That's their idea, right? That's what their objective is to sell the idea that we are reasonable reactionaries and smart leftists will come and talk to us. Now, I have friends who have published stuff in Compact, and I'm not attacking anybody for having done that. But no, the answer is no. Like, the only place for us to go, right? Like, we don't need to go where people read the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or talk about the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or talk about the New York Times, or for that matter, necessarily even talk about dissent. We need to go where workers are. And that's the point where we are in this movement now. And one of the problems that's grown in I almost said this country, that country, right? I mean, over the last 2 or 3 decades, is this notion that of doing well by doing good, which means having a career, right, in the equivalent of the showbiz world, by burnishing your politics, right? I just saw an interview with Brianna Joy Gray, who was Bernie Sanders' communications director in 2020. And it's like appallingly sophomoric twaddle about how Biden is too old, we need somebody else to run. And like, this is all about getting clicks for her. This isn't our politics. So I would strongly urge everyone who is tempted to drink the Compact or American Affairs Kool-Aid to either back off or just go join them. Well, I'm going to say now that from the standpoint of an old-fashioned left of the sort that I am, we have no common ground with the right ever. So, and I'm sorry that I said it the way I said it, because I know it sounds like I'm trying to get a cheap applause line. But I think it's important for us to draw these lines in the dirt. I mean, there are a lot of things have gone, and some of us have talked among ourselves about this a fair amount. But it's in some ways almost like what people understand to be a left and the left understandings of politics at this point often seem very, difficult to suss out. I feel a little better if this were a little thicker and wider for what I'm going to say. But in the last 3 years, we've seen the emergence of what some of us have been calling a NATO left, which just is stunning. And I think that tendency, as well as some others we can talk about, has a direct connection, not to people being evil or being stupid or anything like that, but confusion that's been out there for a long time among the ranks of those who want to think of them as a left. And the stakes are way too great now. We just can't do it. And as I've said once, like in an earlier moment, go ahead. You're welcome to go try to be the left wing of National Socialism if that's what you want to do. But you need to watch the Strasser reel or the Strasser film to the end of the last reel, because that shit doesn't turn out too well. Right. Yeah, thank you. All right, so first thing I'm going to start with a shameless plug. The next episode of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute's Class Matters podcast.org is going to feature Sean Fain and President Mark Demonstein of the American Postal Workers Union and me talking about the state of American politics, the working class movement. And since both of those presidents have called for ceasefire, that's going to come up too, in all likelihood. But there's a lot more to talk about. All right, so now that my shameless plug is out of the way, we'll say a couple things. One is, well, like I said several times during the talk, right? I mean, there is no left. And I know that that's a tough construct for us to start speaking fluently. But it's true, like there is no left. So when we talk about what the left should do, left can't do anything because there is no left. But I'll say this too, like, while what's happened in the UAW, what's happening like in other unions is inspiring, another defect of these 30, 40 years of defeatism and performative politics is that we tend to confuse the beginning for the completion. What we've seen is the beginning of insurgencies, and they look promising. They look really promising and hopeful, right? Even for old, cynical people who don't get hopeful often. But that's all they are. And I mean, just because they've happened doesn't mean anything else in particular is going to follow from them. Right? A whole lot of stuff can go off the rails. I'll say this about the genocide, though, and I haven't said anything in public about it. People who know me know that I've been committed to the Palestinian resistance since the June War, right? And for reasons that are personal as well as political, right? And it is, it's weird, like surreal doesn't do it justice. But watching a genocide unfold on a daily basis in real time is, it obviously pales in comparison to being on the receiving end of the genocide. I make no pretensions about that. But it's fascinating watching the moves that liberals make, right, to justify going to work with the devil. Just as with respect to the is it authoritarianism or is it fascism debate that can kind of sidetrack us from confronting that whatever taxon you want to put it in, the thing is happening on us. The public discussion of whether what occurs or what's occurring on a daily basis in Gaza, and don't forget the West Bank, is a genocide or an ethnic cleansing is repugnant. And it's clearly intended to shift the focus away from what's going on to the fucking name we should call it by, right? And it's kind of hard, to put up with that. I've kept this bottled up in me because I haven't anybody to talk to about it. But I'm not going to go too far. But here's the point where I'm probably going to lose a chunk of the people who were applauding me a couple minutes ago. No matter how terrible Biden is and the Biden administration is, and they are hideous, right? I mean, they're more than enablers and abettors. They're also constantly trying to piss in our faces and tell us it's raining. right? So they're saying, well, like we're calling on Netanyahu to ease it up. But I think they've killed enough Arabs now, right? But nothing the Biden administration would do now or in the next 5 years would come anywhere near what a Republican administration would do. They'd be worse, right? I mean, they would complete the genocide. And if you don't believe me, listen to them, right? They say it every day in Congress, right? Nikki Haley, Nancy Mace, Lindsey Graham, they're all saying, finish him. And they don't mean kill Hamas, because to them there's no difference between Hamas and Palestinians. And that's who their politics are. We can't stop the Biden administration from doing what it's doing. We might be able, if like massive demos keep up around the world, right, I mean, that might slow them down, right? But the reality is that we've got to do whatever we can to keep the Republicans out of office. And that's the only hope we have for anything. A fundamental misunderstanding in left of center politics here has to do with the relations between running candidates for office and building a movement. And like this has been a mantra of mine for so long, like I feel like I'm doing like this when I say it. But from the standpoint of a serious working class left, right, that wants to challenge the foundations of capitalism, you engage in electoral activity as a means for institutionally consolidating victories that have been won on a plane of social movement organizing. We haven't won them. We don't have a movement. So when Jill Stein jumps out there and runs, I was on a panel with Jill Stein at a conference at the 10th anniversary of Katrina in 2015. And yeah, I was working for Bernie. But she says, she laid out some stuff about how if we have the proper program, we could put it out there before the people and run on it. And I said, well, it sounds like you're saying that all you need is a program. If you have a program, you don't have to have resources, organization, commitment. And she said, yeah. And that's been my experience of green politics a lot. Now I've voted for Greens. I voted for Ralph in 2000, right? I've counted up the number of times I voted for Democrats and the number of times I've voted for something else. And it's about what and what. So I'm not shilling for Biden. I'm not slaving for the Democrats. What my focus is a pretty linear and straightforward one. If we want to have any hope of building an alternative progressive political force in this country, which is in some ways one of the most important things we can, in that country, which in some of the ways is one of the most important things we can do in that country for the rest of the world, actually, more so than the solidarity demos, is to create space and dig down with the discipline and start trying to build a movement here. The only reason to vote for Biden now is to get us a little breathing room, right? Kick the can down the road. I think down the road. I think Sam's work makes very clear that's the best we're going to get from Biden, right? There's no, he's going to faint left and do what he's been doing. But we need the space. And yeah, we need the space only if we use it and take advantage of it. And frankly, I'm not too optimistic about how many of us who identify with the left are seriously committed to trying to build that kind of working class politics in the first place. So it might just be holding off the inevitable for 4 years. But that's my response anyway. Yeah, no, thank you. Or so I'll start with the last one. Look, I couldn't agree with you more. And I would add, too, like to the Roe v. Wade story, one of the things that happened there was when Sheryl Sandberg and Hillary Clinton and other bourgeois feminists took over the agenda for the women's movement, right, basically. And like, right, I mean, some of, well, I can look out, but I can see there are other people who can recall when the women's movement fought for stuff like comparable worth, pay equity, rights on a job, and publicly funded free child and elder care, right? Class-based programs, right? Housing support, and even something called reproductive freedom. What clever bourgeois feminists and the pollsters did was turned it in to not even abortion rights, but to the right to choose, which fits with the neoliberal perspective and also helps the right in insinuating that leftists or I mean, liberals are trying to put something over on it, right? Trying to hide something from it. So yes, but beyond that, though, like your fundamental point, I think is absolutely correct, and I think that's what the referenda around the country have been showing, that when we can disconnect the issues that people feel concerned about in their lives from this partisan soap opera, then we can get a hearing, and yes, we can win the hearing, and that's what we've been trying to do. We aren't alone, but that's how we've been trying to operate, like in DJDI. Second question was, yes, brother, I agree, totally. I mean, and I mean the Christian fascism thing is like real. It's kind of interesting watching that too, and it's kind of interesting watching the alliance between reactionary Zionists and anti-Semitic Christian fascists, who are the most open and obvious and committed anti-Semites in America, which says something about how secure the right-wing Zionists must feel politically. The stormtroopers question, there are a lot of them out there, right? I mean, they're volunteer, right? I mean, like every state that's passed concealed carry has a plethora of them. Right, they're out there, right? I mean, but also, complement in Congress, right? Boebert, Green, and others. So I hope that's an adequate response. Okay. If Trump wins the White House, right, and if the Republicans have both houses of Congress and the judiciary, then they've won everything, right? I mean, they can impose whatever they want. Like the Supreme Court, for instance, through the Federalist Society, has concocted this preposterous thing known as major questions doctrine. What major question doctrine means is that federal administrative agencies don't have power to act on, to enforce any law or the regular law that speaks to what the Supreme Court decides is a major question. So that destroys the regulatory apparatus of the federal government, right? I mean, if they win, Trump will do it, right? There's more and more and more, right? That'll be the end of Social Security. It'll be the end of Medicare. It will be the end of the National Labor Relations Board. It will be the end of civil rights enforcement. And what that means is that, yeah, I mean, Biden's not much. The Biden administration is not much. And the Senate majority is not much either. But the stakes are really, really high for a lot of people. And look, I've hardly ever in my life voted for something. Right, so the idea that that's what you vote to do, this seems kind of foreign to me, right? With the exception of 2 votes I cast for Bernie Sanders, I can't think of another one. Well, Barry Commoner or Ralph. But the vast majority of votes that I've cast have been against something or other. I mentioned to somebody earlier, like I'm contemplating calling John Fetterman to demand my campaign contributions back, right? So this voting isn't the domain where we go to get the shit that we want, right? And when you assume that that's what it is, but, I mean, by the way, it's another marker of the victory of the right and of neoliberalism that we think that our most meaningful, like, political participation should be channeled down into this vote. Yeah, it doesn't mean all that much, except in the limited ways that it does. And it's important for us to realize the limited ways that voting can mean something. Like, they can help save us from something worse than what might happen if the other thing wins. And that's why I think it's important to vote for Biden. It's pretty straightforward. I wouldn't say that I know enough. It seems that the Canadian government has followed the U.S. Along foreign policy lines as much as I've been accustomed to seeing the Canadian government follow the U.S. What I know about the deep character of trade union and working class based politics in Canada, I know mainly from my friends sitting here. So all I would do would be to parrot what they've said to me, but it seems like, despite the fact that they keep either telling me that things aren't that much better up here, or some of them even threaten to build a wall if people like me start trying to run up here, I still have a sense that things, and for objective reasons, that things aren't quite as bad. There's more space to operate within Canada than there is in the U.S., and I hope that's right. Well, see, this, I think the position that you just articulated is what's now being called accelerationism, I believe, that things have to get worse before they get better. A good trade union leader friend of mine once said, you know, the only thing I've ever seen come from a little bit of fascism is like a lot of fascism, right? And I think we're still waiting for that uprising in 1930s Germany, aren't we? I mean, that shit didn't quite come. Because part of the problem is that what the authoritarian governments do is remove the capabilities for uprising. And see, that's how we need to think this thing through, right? Like, if we want to, fighting Biden, and I know for some people this might sound doofus, voting for Biden to fight against Biden, to keep is not so much voting for Biden to fight against Biden, but to vote for Biden to keep from having to fight against Trump, who will make it impossible for us to fight against it, right? And that's just what it comes down to. It's just that simple, right? It's like no good choice, right? There's no good choice, but what I would think a left sensibility ought to be driven by is recognizing that there's no good choice and figure out the least destructive choice you can make rather than blowing off steam. And yeah, we all can blow off steam about this. Fuck Joe Biden, right? But then giving into the fantasy that there could be some other option. There is no other option. So it's those two. And sometimes it's just the way it is. Sometimes you just have to take the milk of magnesia.
All right, everyone, let's wrap this up with one big thank you to
Hey, no, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.